You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We're coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to Rethreading Madness.
When I've never been further, knowing what the hell I'm gonna do. When I can't seem to find my way under or over or through.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Bob Joseph, who is the founder and president of the Indigenous Corporate Training. He helps people by guiding training and supporting them in their reconciliation journey. Much of what he's about to do with us here today, so that they are working effectively with Indigenous people and changing the world. So a very, very important conversation to have as people who are white, who aren't First Nations and or Indigenous, and really want to understand, what does reconciliation mean? It's a word that we have out there. I'm sure we've all heard of it, at least here in BC. I have no doubt everybody's heard about it, but we don't always understand exactly what it means. Bob is a certified master trainer, a former associate professor at Royal Roads University, and has developed training courses and written an award-winning best-selling book called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. And that's kind of what we're here to talk about. Welcome, Bob.
Hey, thank you.
I can't tell you how much I've looked forward to this conversation, because I have all my own questions about what did the Indian Act mean? How did it impact on people? How does it shape how white people think about First Nations people? And what can we do about it? So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. One of the things I want to start out with is the word Indian. And of course, if you are somebody who's, been alive in the last 20 years, Indian is not the word to use when you're talking about First Nations people. But in your case, there is still something called, in quotes, the Indian Act, right?
Correct. Yeah. It still governs the life of peoples from birth to death, and defines who they are according to a set of rules, not laid out by the peoples themselves, but as part of Canada's post-Confederation assimilation policy. We were going to try and assimilate them, and if you need a KPI to track when that has actually happened. So we set up a whole system of identifying who an Indian was. And for those of you that don't know, it simply means the creation of a list, and literally an Indian agent would show up at your community one day with a pen and piece of paper, and they'd ask you for your name, and you'd say, Kaksamalagalese, and they'd say, okay, Bob Joseph, it is.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but it's such an outrageous thing to do, to literally walk in somewhere and change someone's name. Like,
I think it probably wasn't just unique to Indians. I've heard similarities with Ellis Island and New York and places like that too. It's just a complete lack of respect, and not even a willingness to try.
Yes.
You know,
No, you're right. Absolutely. There were lots of people who were immigrants who came here and were told, you need to have an English name, I think they called it.
Yeah. So basically it means if your name appears on a banned list, you are a status Indian. And the goal, of course, is an assimilation process is to get your name off the banned list. And now it's become much more complicated because you have status Indians who aren't members of bands, and maybe were adopted, and all of those issues that have come sort of after that. But
Right.
at its core, status Indian is that's what it is. Your name appears on a banned list, and the goal is to actually take your name off the list, and that's what we see happening. And it was possible for non-Indians, anybody else, to get their name on a banned list. A lot of people probably don't remember this, but prior to 1985, if a status Indian man married a non-status Indian woman, she could be from any culture in the world. She would gain her status, and so would their children.
Right.
And it didn't work the same for the women, Indian women who lost their status through marrying non-Indian men. And that meant that you had to leave the reserve, and none of the programs or services through Indigenous Services Canada would apply. And that creates a whole other set of challenges. For the record, I think Indigenous people is probably the safe ground. When I teach our working effectively with Indigenous peoples training, they ask us all the time, "What's the best terminology, Bob?" And I'll say, well, I think there's a lot of best terminology. It does depend, and I hate using the depends answer, but some Indigenous peoples are totally proud to be Indian. Say, I'm an Indian, and we still see that reflected in some band names in the province, even.
Right.
And so it is possible, to be working with the Okanagan Indian Band, who's a member of maybe the Okanagan Nation Alliance. Those would be some kind of examples that I can remember from my past days doing community engagement. And so we saw a lot of that change happening sort of post 1982. But Indigenous peoples, two words together, the S on the end, I think that's some good advice. Underneath Indigenous peoples, you have three main categories: the Indian, the Inuit, and Métis peoples. And I shouldn't say the Inuit, because Inuit stands for the people, translates the people. And so First Nations typically would fall under Indian in Section 35 of the Constitution Act, where it defines who Aboriginal peoples are, which is our constitutionally correct terminology here in Canada. There's three groups of people. So there you go. Quick crash course in terminology.
No kidding. I was speaking with a woman, Dr. Vickers, here about Indian residential schools, and she and I questioned that because that was the terminology she used, and she said that it's important to call it an Indian residential school because that is what it was called back then.
And it would be accurate too, in the sense of, historically that was a definition. Now, one of the things I, didn't realize is that sometimes other peoples went to residential schools, Métis peoples or Inuit, depending on how things sort of played out in a region. But yeah, Indian residential schools, definitely the terminology. And
well, fun fact, I am very white, come from the prairies of Alberta, and I went to a residential school, which I didn't realize it at the time. It was not the ones on the list. I mean, you can find the list of which ones were terribly abusive and which ones were not. And I was in the one that was not, and most likely because half the kids there were white. Now, the people I know that were there with me, who were First Nations, half of them were, did say that the things changed when the white kids went home for the weekend. I don't know to what degree, but I always resist saying that out loud because it implies something that is not true for me. And but anyway, so fun fact about Bernadine. And it's why I know so many First Nations people, because I, in fact, married one of those people in that school. So let's talk about the Indian Act. Why was it when did it come into being, and why is it here? Why is it still in existence? Maybe that's too broad a question. Let's start.
Yeah, I know we only have about 4 hours today, so I'll keep my answer brief.
Sorry. Okay, let's start with what is it?
So the Indian Act really, was a consolidation of Indian policy, and this Indian policy had been in existence before Confederation. So Canada becomes a country, and that what is it, 1867, and officially becomes a country with the passage of the British North America Act. Before that, there would have been Indian policy because of the Royal Proclamation and colonial governments. Different colonial governments were operating over different times in what would become Canada. And by the time we confederate, though, Canada has come up with a policy that it feels it needs to assimilate Indians into the political and economic mainstream of the country. And it does mark a pretty big shift in Indian policy prior to Canada being a country, going way back to the Royal Proclamation of October 1763. We would have saw that King George III would have referred to them as the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we live and who live under our protection and should not be molested or disturbed in possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as not having been ceded to or purchased by us. So it's a really important paragraph from the Royal Proclamation. He does refer to them in the same paragraph, both as Indians and as nations. And what he is doing is he's trying to gain control of what would become Canada, because at that time, in that era, there was a lot of competition for who could gain control over Canada and its lands and resources. There were Spanish traders advancing northward from Mexico, Russian traders advancing southward from Alaska. So if you've ever seen those blue trade beads that people will wear as part of their jewelry, we also have the British were here. Later on, there would be American expansionist interest. And what King George III had realized by 1763 was that those nations of people would hold the balance of power in any military campaigns that would be fought. And so specifically, he comes out of the Battle of Quebec with this idea that, if it wasn't for the First Nations, those nations or tribes, this could have gone either way. The British and the French were evenly matched on the plains of Abraham. And so his proclamation really is a reflection of that understanding. These are valuable military allies, but they're also valuable economic allies, because at that time they could pick and choose who they would sell their furs and other products to. And they didn't have to sell to just one company, as it were. And so all of that leads him to this royal proclamation. These are nations or tribes. They own the lands that they are using and occupying. And they have the right to fish and hunt and to exist as they were. I think Gene Roddenberry might have borrowed the prime directive from the Royal Proclamation when, King George says they're not to be molested or disturbed
Right.
in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories. So a little shout out for the Trekkies there.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so if people aren't aware who Gene Roddenberry is, he is the father of Star Trek for sure, creator and father, and continues on to be. But we won't
Yeah.
divert onto Star Trek.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
can I just ask you a quick question before we go on? Assimilate. I have been doing some research, and assimilating people into your own culture was presented to white people. And I know this firsthand from where I grew up. It was presented as us being kind and generous and, helping people learn things that they couldn't learn because they were primitive or were seen as primitive. I need to take that back because they weren't primitive. Um, and not that primitive would be bad. But it was bad in terms of how white people saw it. But that wasn't really, that was what we were told assimilation was. My understanding, and correct me, God, correct me if I'm wrong, was that the government's goal was not assimilation for the good of the First Nations people. It was assimilation so that they could wipe out the term nation, so they could diminish the concept of nation and therefore right to the land.
It does have a lot to do with that, when we
Okay,
think about assimilation. And it was a big idea in that 1870s era, right? We often referred to, America was the melting pot, right? And
right,
Canada had a lot of those same ideas, as well
right.
as the Commonwealth. Um, and so the idea by 1867 is that if we could assimilate them, make them like everybody else, and this is according to a guy who writes the book, Dr. Paul Tennant, a professor out of UBC, who puts together a book called Aboriginal Peoples and Politics. And his idea was that if we could get them to assimilate, um, and they did become like everybody else, there would be no need to do modern treaties in
Hmm.
British Columbia. There'd be no need to recognize special fishing and hunting rights. In fact, all of that would have been um, would have been in assimilation would have taken care of the Cowichan decision and modern treaties and the duty to consult that ties projects up like the Trans Mountain Crossing project and takes it from a $5 billion estimated budgeted project to a $32 billion project.
Hmm. Hmm.
All of that comes from this idea that they were supposed to assimilate. And the problem for Canada is that it doesn't happen. Nobody had, the founding fathers and, Duncan Campbell Scott, some of the architects of Indian residential schools and Indian policy around assimilation, actually didn't imagine that they didn't think this was a dying race of people. They're a primitive culture. This is just going to take a matter of time.
Hmm.
And so it starts off in sort of fairly good terms, if you will, or some ideas, I think, which I pick up on from the first part of your comments. But when it starts not working, that's when it starts to get aggressive. We're going to start taking away their kids. We're going to force them to learn English. We're going to separate them from their families. We're going to overthrow hereditary chiefs and replace them with elected chiefs because you can't have a hereditary chief, which I find is totally ironic because,
No kidding.
the way you govern yourselves is primitive. You
Well,
shouldn't use those hereditary chiefs. You should use an elected chief like we do. And I'm thinking, you got a king,
I know.
kind of a hereditary inherited a chieftainship, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. No
But it
kidding.
was, but it was what we wanted to look at. And the whole idea of primitive cultures sets that stage for this very, soft touch. Oh,
Yes.
they're primitive cultures. They live short, brutish lives. And what we're going to do is help them. And today, in part of our reconciliation journey, I would tell people, it wasn't particularly helpful. In fact, it was the exact opposite. And it was hiding what was really happening,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
or Indians and other indigenous people on occasion.
Um, yeah, I've also seen examples where the government wanting to take more and more land didn't really tell the settlers that what was true about what had happened so that that land was free. And so they kind of used the settlers to take land as well as at the same time that they were hurting the First Nations people. And I just also want to say that um, I think you're being awfully kind when you describe what they did in terms of trying to assimilate, because they not only just took children, they've committed a genocide, and they're continuing to do that. It hasn't really changed, and I know you know this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I just want to be clear that white people have done some really absolutely horrendous things to First Nations people.
In the name of civilization,
Yes. And the
right?
really bad part of that comment is that the more I understand the First Nations culture, and the more I'm getting at that they were way more civilized than white people were. They were they had structure and ways of dealing with each other that was so much more civilized, not just with each other, but with the land and everything. And of course, we're paying the price now. So what kinds of things are held in the Indian Act? What does it do in
Well,
terms of real things too? Oh, you know what? I just noticed the time. I've got so carried away talking to you. We need to just take a little break, but we'll be right back, folks.
Through Tree Canada's National Greening Program, native tree seedlings are planted across Canada, creating a widespread impact. The planted trees provide habitat, prevent soil erosion, and reforest areas that have suffered tree loss due to pests, weather, etc. Tree Canada performs 1, 2, and 5-year assessments to ensure tree survival is similar to natural forests. To learn more or get involved, go to treecanada.ca.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I'm speaking with Bob Joseph about the Indian Act. You wrote a book, Bob, about, well, you've written a couple books. The one that caught my eye was 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. So tell us, what does the Indian Act do, and what are the things that we need to know about it?
yeah. So first of all, we build on the proclamation. That kind of is the first main era of Canadian history. The second main era is when we confederate, going back to 1867. And we see this flip-flop in Indian policy. They're going from nations or tribes to wards of the crown. So in 1867, we give control over Indians and lands reserved for Indians to the federal government. And that control would come with a fiduciary duty. There's a legal obligation on the part of Indian Affairs, who's just made us wards of the crown, to look after our interests in doing so. So that's what they call the fiduciary duty. And it's a constitutional commitment, really, this fiduciary duty to look after Indians and lands reserved for Indians and until they assimilate. And so that's when we start to see things coming in. We see the creation of reserve lands. So one of the things that you mentioned was they had sort of land all over the place. And again, back to Paul Tennant's book, Aboriginal Peoples and Politics. He talked about on the Lower Mainland, for example, where they'd been living all along the river in quite large settlements and surviving on fish for millennia upon millennia. But they weren't putting the land to its highest and best use. So what we started to do was create reserve lands, places that couldn't be claimed by settlers or colonists, whatever the preferred terminology is. And often those reserve lands were out of the way of agricultural activities. So I think about, Chehalis and some of those communities where, they were actually in a different place perhaps. And so you see a lot of that relocation happening onto reserves, which they don't own, by the way. A reserve is actually a holding pen, for lack of a better description, a place where we would put them until they assimilate. And the ultimate title is in reserve lands is vested in Her Majesty. So they don't own the homes, they don't own the houses, they don't own the land. You can ask them though, Bob, do you own that chunk of reserve land? A lot of times they'll say, yes, I do. My family's been here for 4 generations. But legally, technically speaking, they don't own the land that they live on. It's merely set aside for their use and benefit. And out of that become some of the modern problems, right? You don't have a house and land. It's merely set aside for your use and benefit. So you can't go to the bank and borrow money to get into agriculture or fishing or forestry or any of those other things. So it starts to do that. The Indian Act actually says that reserve lands aren't subject to seizure under legal process. And that was for our protection. But, protecting us from people who would buy our lands or, whatever the rationale was. But it definitely hindered people. We created lists, status Indians, and then looked for a whole bunch of other rules for how to remove those names from the list, and created different categories of status Indian, and then had
Wow.
court cases since to try to clarify what we mean. And we also said the way you're governing yourselves is not proper. They had traditional governments or hereditary chiefs, or, there's all kinds of different social structure. But along comes the Department of Indian Affairs and says, Bernadine, the way you govern yourselves, that's wrong. You need to elect a chief and council.
Right.
So you're allowed a chief and council for every 100 members. If you've got a 205 members, you've got one chief and one council member. Now, here's the deal. People think, well, it's democracy. What's wrong with that? Well,
Well, let's look at the United States.
yeah, the reality is if you're a chief or a council member or a chief council member, you are elected by the people, but you're accountable to Indian Affairs. They tell you where the money comes from, what you can spend it on. They can go after you if you're mishandling funds, and all kinds of things around land and what kind of houses you can develop. Like I say, it's a birth to death
Yeah.
document. And
I lived on the reserve at one point, and very young, was 16, 17 years old. And one of the things that I came away from it, even at that age, was how the government had made everybody a child. And I was not a political person at that point. I was just somebody who could see what was going on. So we've understood this from kind of what white people were trying to do. Well, how was that different from what First Nations did before white people came in and imposed that?
well, we were already, pardon me, we were already self-governing, self-determining, and self-reliant.
Mm,
And the Indian Act has had that whole opposite effect, right? We aren't self-determining. Somebody in Ottawa gets to tell us who our people are, which we believe is wrong. We have the right, pardon me, we have the right to name our people, and it's not granted by Indian Affairs or the federal government. We think of it as an inherent right. It's given to us by the Creator, and so we've always provided names and citizenship to our people, as opposed to status and non-status determined by somebody else. We were self-governing. We had our own forms of governance. And in British Columbia here, anthropologists will tell you that they were rank or hierarchy society governments, because on a river like the Fraser River, you could support huge populations of people with very little effort and very little movement geographically speaking. You build your house in the right place and those fish will swim right to you.
mm,
And you could support thousands and thousands of people. And whenever you have a lot of people in a small area, geographically speaking, you need to develop mechanisms to work out the disputes that inevitably occur when you got a lot of people in a small area. So you've got these rank or hierarchy society governments, and very advanced, and thinking about their people, much longer term thinking than the 4 year government cycles that we're in now.
mhm.
Had a principle that they called the seventh generation principle. Not everybody called it that, but in my experience, they were all thinking well beyond 4 years. They're thinking more like four, five, six, seven generations, and
Mhm.
and so they had these governance that did that. Potlatching. So I've got a chief's name and a seat in our house, but I haven't done my first potlatch, which is defined as a gift-giving ceremony, the definition of a potlatch. And what I'll do is I'll stand up and I'll hand out names, and I'll share songs, dances, crests. I'll talk about our territory and our governance, and I'll do it in front of the whole community. And at the end of the potlatch, I'm obligated to give gifts to all of the participants, the chiefs, the matriarchs, participants. And if you were there and you accepted my gift, you were accepting that I had the right to claim those names, those songs, those dances, that territory. And so it was a very important central distribution of wealth model
Mhm.
for us. And we do, think think it was, different than some of the political systems we see today, where
Very different. Yes.
where we were in it in order to gain rank as a Kwakwaka'wakw hereditary chief, you had to give away. And the more you gave away, the higher your rank, which sent the message to the people that you weren't in it for your own benefit, but you were
Mhm.
in it for their benefit. So the ultimate status symbol of a Kwakwaka'wakw hereditary chief was the shirt on your back in the house you lived in, having distributed all the wealth to the peoples. And so perhaps a little bit different that way. And
Yeah, one of the ways that that is very different is that, in white culture, power, having rank, as you're talking about, power is power over, power to decide, power to control, power to take. And what you're talking about is recognizing that power is responsibility, and that that is so much more accurate, because when you have power, you do have a responsibility to the people around you, but it's not always translated that way in white culture.
I think it's a Spider-Man quote, isn't it? With great power comes great responsibility.
Yes, but I suspect lots of white people have no idea what that means, quite frankly. So I,
We do have responsibility. So the right to determine self-government, and then most importantly, we were self-reliant. In fact, some of the old Indian agents said, when they were talking about our culture before the full force of assimilation and full legislative authority of the Canadian state hit them, they were saying these are some of the most independent, hardest working people that I've ever seen and met.
mm,
We'd love to get back to that, but right now we're in places that we can't borrow money to get into the economy. There's discrimination, all kinds of things that really hinder our participation in the political and economic mainstream. So those were some of the learnings I had coming out of high school. Are we lazy, really? Why do we think, talking about health, for example,
mm,
why is substance abuse such a problem? And then you realize it's, primarily residential schools that,
mm,
cause the trauma that, like a lot of my relatives came out of those schools and poured themselves into the bottom of a bottle and never came out. And I often wondered why. And it was like, are we just weak? Some of the tropes, right? Oh, they just don't have that resistance. They don't have a gene. No, it's because they were extremely traumatized.
yes,
And then
extremely traumatized. I just want to highlight that word, extremely traumatized.
and the effects are intergenerational. They pass
Yes.
those through the genes into the next generation, and so some of the challenges that communities have, I just see as just as a result of trauma, and especially for kids. I think about, I hope I say his name properly, Gabor Mate, mate.
Mate Gabor, yes.
Yeah, Matt Takeover. You know, he was talking to Joe Rogan on a podcast one time, and he said, Joe said, "What is ADHD?" And you know, the response was, "Well, Joe, you're a fighter. What happens if you're walking down the street and somebody challenges you?" And Joe said, "Well, I either fight or I run." And the response was, "That is a normal range of response. But what happens if you're little and you can neither fight nor run?" And that's why that's what ADHD is, and help me understand a lot about communities as well. That the kids that were in those schools could neither fight nor run till they
Right.
got older, and so you can imagine some of the mental health challenges coming out of that whole process. Um,
And also, I want to really sort of point out as well the things that we know from Amnesty International and the ideas of torture, is that it's not just the kids going through the residential schools, and then, of course, becoming parents and then having this experience, which is that taking away someone's children is one of the worst forms of torture that you can do. So, you talk about coming out of the schools and finding a solution with a bottle. It also would have been true for the first parents who were experiencing having their children taken away. And I would imagine that for a First Nations family, that is even more traumatizing than in white culture.
I
And I
think
may be making a
I think,
comparison that isn't there, but that,
when I was doing my workshops, and I have been doing them since 1994. Sometimes we talk about residential schools, and I would hear people say, "Oh man, if somebody came to take my kids, I'd kill them. I would
yeah.
do anything and everything." No, you wouldn't. You couldn't. You're absolutely powerless, which is what made, Prime Minister Harper's apology so poignant. He talked about powerless people.
Mhm. Yeah. We just need to take a little break, but we'll be right back, folks. Don't go away.
Eoch Tanuyap, Quiget Yuans Queensna. Hi, everybody. My name is Quiget Yuans. I'm a member of the Squamish Nation and the Yagalanas clan of the Haida Nation. You're listening to Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We live, work, play, and broadcast from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I'm speaking with Bob Joseph, author of 21 Things You Should Know About the Indian Act. Bob, this has been a fascinating conversation. I kind of generally touched on a whole lot of things, and my God, I could talk to you for hours. But let's pull this back into, given all of that, how has what has happened because of the Indian Act, because of the racism and all of the stuff that happened to First Nations people here in Canada, how does it impact on people's mental health?
Uh, well, we were talking about it just a few moments ago. I think about substance abuse and the trauma of childhood, and then the intergenerational passing of that trauma through the genes to kids and grandkids. And I think that's probably, some of the bigger things that happened. That's just on one issue, residential schools. Banning of the potlatch was traumatic for the Kwakwakiwak, for example, where they said, the way you're governing yourselves was wrong, which was in a potlatch. They forced us to elect a chief and council. And then because there was some religious zealousy here too, right? This was the potlatch would have had all these masks and dances, and it was somebody other than the God we knew, right? As a larger society, as a colonizing society. It was a different God. And so we had to stamp that out. So we get pretty aggressive. We ban potlatches, which sends them underground, but they would still catch people potlatching. And the Indian agent, in and along the coast was often very religious, very Christian, would confiscate regalia, donate it to public collections, sell it to private collectors, and even burned some of that stuff in effigy. There was just so much potlatch regalia they couldn't take it all, so they took what they thought was most valuable, burned the rest, and a lot of that collection, which is the euphemism for, when I used to go to the Royal Museum in Victoria, you'd see, Kwakwakiwak Unicwa mask collected 1927. Collected was just a euphemism for what actually had happened. It was confiscated and then donated to a public collection. In a lot of cases, not all, some of it was purchased, but right now there's a whole process of repatriation going on in Canada and around the globe where people are trying to get their stuff back that was taken. It was be like going into the Parliament and taking the mace of arm or the coat of arms and the mace and all of the stuff that you valued and had high symbolic value.
I would take that one step farther. That would be like going into the Vatican and taking artifacts like the pieces from the cross of that he was crucified on, or these very sort of sacred objects. And I think people don't understand that. They think it's just a mask, but the mask is imbued with all kinds of meaning. So we're talking about people coming in and taking regalia, taking the culture, the things that, sacred parts of a culture, burning them, cutting hair, removing language, which is another thing that happened in residential schools, is that people were, not allowed to speak their language. So, and language is so important in a culture because there's so many words and it's just that resonance of, in people's lives.
And it was, to add to that, arresting politicians, right? They were taking chiefs, sending them to Ocala, where they would slop the pigs. I mean, that stuff that I hear in the oral society. Plus, it was, you know, just some of it was documented in different books, right? So we would never arrest politicians today, would we? Um, not in not in Canada.
Well,
I'm just I'm being
we're,
cheeky
we're
now.
we're looking across the border, wondering when that's about to happen. But no,
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
democracy, you would not be doing that.
Yeah, now you get guys wanting to go after Obama, and it's just like, oh man.
Mhm.
So, anyways, that was happening, had full support, low level of knowledge maybe in the general population, um, and language, very forceful about the language. Yeah, if you can get people to stop learning their language, and go check out the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, sort of resources and just some of the punishment for speaking language,
Right.
it's so harsh,
Oh God. Yeah.
like physical, torturous, extreme violence to try and stop kids from speaking their language. And the problem was, for a lot of them, and it comes through, but you really have to look for it, is they had never spoken. My dad had never spoken another language till he got there, and now he was being punished, and he had to learn English right quick because he still has problems hearing today because he would get slapped pretty hard when he was 5 or 6 years old, right? For speaking in Kwakwala, but he said I didn't know English. I didn't even know English existed.
No.
And that was the
And
thing, that was a unique thing about the West Coast here in Canada, was that, the assimilation process started on the other side, on the Atlantic side, and slowly worked its way here. So there were still Indigenous peoples here on the Northwest Coast living free of control from the Department of Indian Affairs and Indian Act legislation into the late 1800s. So the historical experience much closer than, say, Ontario, where they had 300-400 years of interrelationships, right? So there'd be
mhm.
some differences that way too.
Were there any Indigenous peoples that did expire? That's not the right word. Vanish.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to chuckle, but it reminds me of a group of people called the Sinaiks Nation, and it's a more recent example. It goes back to the 50s, and I was working for a company doing consultation, and we got a sort of the memo from the province saying, here's the 10 communities we think you should talk to, right? And so
Mm.
we sent letters saying we want to talk to you about some work that we have to do, and we did a round table session, and at the start of the first meeting, who are you? What do you hope to get out of this process? Good community engagement type stuff, right? And we got the 10 people that we sent letters to, but we got this one extra one. Hi, I'm Marilyn. I'm from the Sinaiks Nation. Our territory is the Arrow Lakes region. We're really glad you're here to consult with us about our Section 35 rights. And so we're looking forward to this whole conversation. And um, which was great. Our people on the other side, we had this list of 10 communities, and we were flipping through the papers madly to go, who's Sinaiks, and we had nothing. So we politely said, can you tell us a little bit more about the Sinaiks Nation? Yep. A while back, Indian Affairs declared us administratively extinct. We're still here. We're still a people. We still have our territory, and we're looking forward to you talking to us about our Section 35 rights. And so we were, back to the mother corporation, and there was a little bit of panic there. I think on our side, what do we do? Sinaiks, who are they? And
Mm.
and so we decide, because Indian Affairs had declared them administratively extinct, we decided to go talk to them. And so we show up at Indian Affairs on Alberni Street. It was still called that then. It's Indigenous Services Canada now. And we said, hey, the Sinaiks Nation recently showed up at consultative table, and um, they told us you guys had declared them administratively extinct, and we're just unsure what this means for consultation and any ideas that you might have, for us. And the interesting thing was they showed up with, the lawyers and, senior civil servants, right? And the answer was, wow, you guys couldn't have stumbled upon something bigger if you tried. I mean, the policy implications, the legal ramifications, the financial considerations are staggering in what we're talking about. And the response, I can still remember, it was something along the lines of, we would be hard pressed to talk to the Sinaiks Nation. It was like, So they weren't even giving us an answer. The company I was working for, we wanted them to tell us what to do. They were saying what they wouldn't do, which we thought was interesting, right? Yeah, that was.
And they wouldn't do it because of the legal and financial implications.
And yeah, all of that policy, broad policy, financial, legal, yeah. So we, this was a crown corporation. We do have another level of government to go visit. We went to the province, the attorney general, and said, "Hey, this is what we're wrestling with here." And oh, by the way, we've talked to the feds, and so we're just wondering what it means. They're declared administratively extinct, which means they're not here, extinct, right? And but they're demanding to be talked to, and Section 35 says, we should talk to them. And so the province said, "What did the feds say?" And so we told them, and they were like, "That's what we're saying." And we're like, "Okay." And we go back to our company, and we just happen to have a rights and title lawyer, and we were sort of kicking it around, kind of trying to make a decision, talk or don't talk to the Sinaiks Nation. And I can remember the lawyer said, "Hey, look, I'm your lawyer. I'm on your side. So just hear me out. I think we should talk to them, because as your lawyer, I have to defend you if we decide not to talk to them."
Mm-hmm.
And and he said, and he was starting to be a little bit sarcastic. He said, "I don't know if you've ever been to a courtroom, but they're going to be on that side with their lawyers at a table. We're going to be on this side of the aisle with our lawyers at a table. In front of us will be a judge, and there'll be some kind of gate and, some places for the gallery for people to sit." And he said, "The problem that I have as your lawyer is we're going to go in there and I'm going to have to argue they're not here." And
the nation is not there.
yeah, the nation is not here, but clearly they're sitting right across the aisle.
Yes.
They're lawyers in front of the judge.
Yeah.
And so he said, I think we should talk to them. And that's the side of the conversation that won out. He went in with, we had to find some way, though, because it was so sensitive, Bernadine, that we needed to find a way that would allow us to talk to them, to hear what they're saying, to make adjustments to our project, right?
Right.
And so we went with something that we called observer status. What do you suggest? We asked our lawyer. "I think we should go with observer status. They can come in, sit like they're actually here participating, and whatever they say, we incorporate into our duty to consult stuff. And we just try to avoid this whole conversation about whether they're here or not here." And so it was a neat introduction, and along the way they've made big progress. Recently, they one of their members of the Sinaiks Nation. So what happened? Indian Affairs declared them extinct, and what was the makeup of them moved in, joined their American counterparts. But in their view, there was no Canada, US. The border was just something that somebody else had made up. They just moved in with their kin, basically.
Right.
And so they were claiming Section 35 rights, and the courts recently agreed that, yeah, because of what happened, we can't look the other way here. They're still here. They're still exercising the rights.
Well, how bizarre somebody is asking you to look at a person and say, "I can't see you."
Yeah. Well, hey, it's very legal, and a lot of it goes back to the Royal Proclamation that there are nations of tribes, that they have the right to fish and hunt as formerly, that they own the lands. And so the problem with the Indian Act and assimilation is it didn't work. And so we didn't conquer them, and they didn't assimilate, which technically means they still own the land unless they have treaties. So back where you grew up on the prairies, there's lots of numbered treaties, right? And
Hmm.
in those treaties, they actually did cede, release, and surrender forever their lands in exchange for a whole bunch of other things, oxes and plows and education and
Right,
those kinds of things, right? Where in British Columbia, we didn't conclude the treaty process like
right,
other provinces did because by the time it rolls around, we're already full scale into an assimilation process. And if they assimilate and become like everybody else, there's no special fishing
right.
privileges, no land claims, no treaties. You don't even have to, you know what, if this assimilation works, we don't even have to honor the historic treaties
I
in
know.
Alberta, Saskatchewan.
That was the point of it, wasn't it? Was money and um you are I just want we have to go soon, but I want people to know where can they get your book?
It's available at any great bookstore, and certainly the independent bookstores have been really supportive of us too. So,
Okay. And Amazon, I'm assuming they can get it
yeah,
off
yeah,
Amazon.
you can get it there as well.
Um, and you have a potlatch coming up. You mentioned it briefly before.
Mhm.
Um, and that is not open to everybody, but it is happening on, you're gonna have to tell me. I'm gonna try and say this name, but I'm gonna mess it up, I'm sure. It's Sumalagawese. Some
Aksan Malagalese is yeah, that's my chief's name. So I'll be hosting a potlatch hopefully this August. And I say hopefully because we have lots of rules about potlatching. So I've actually scheduled two previous potlatches. The one I had it for last August, but then my my brother's daughter passed away, so we're not allowed to do this type of work, within a year of that death. So
right,
it's the postponement to this August, and then we had another relative the first time I tried to do a potlatch, who passed away and required the year of waiting, and before the year ran out, the pandemic hit.
right.
So we've been, you know, just following the rules, the law, as we call it, and postponing. And so hopefully this August I'll be able to host a potlatch. We'll give away names and songs and dances and crests and celebrate birth, death, puberty, and marriage. Those are the main things that we try to do. And yeah, then we'll give all of our guests gifts. And we're going to do it in a location where my dad had his first potlatch, which was Guilford Island. So
Mm,
it's a remote potlatch. It's, we're going to have to boat people into a community that, where we're from, the homeland,
hmm,
we would call it. And
hmm.
we it hasn't had clean drinking water for close to a couple of decades, and there's still people that live there, but there's all kinds of challenges. And again, those are Indian Act problems, right?
Right.
Reason, the reason there's so many missing and murdered Indigenous women is because there's not enough housing on reserve, and so they're forced to leave the reserve, and they end up in Vancouver and Victoria in shelters and halfway houses, and just all of the problems that come out
Oh,
of that whole chronic underfunding of Indian Affairs, who just actually cut a couple of $1 billion from their budget, which means even less services to
oh
the
my God.
people living on reserves.
And has there been, I know we're going over time, but has there been, so you have to answer this quickly, has there been any research that has looked at the impact of the Indian Act?
I can't think of any just off the top of my head. It has been, for policy papers and that, there's always stuff coming out about that, about all of the issues that come with it too, incarceration. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
It seems to me that it's had a very detrimental impact. But yeah, we need to stop, Bob. I'm so sorry.
No
Honestly,
worries.
I
No
have like a
worries.
thousand questions in my head, but
It's like the Hollywood ending, Bernadine. We always got to leave them wanting more.
there you go. So that just means I have to connect with you again very soon and have continue on this conversation. So I would love that. So thank you, Bob.
All right. Thank you.
And we'll be right back, folks. And that's it. I'm sorry. I would have honestly, I just would love to continue chatting, but
No worries. No worries. You're on a time crunch. That's good. We got a little bit accomplished in an hour, so we're good.
it's probably really good I'm not doing a podcast because my podcast would be 4 hours long. So anyway,
You'd get a chance to really talk about it, but yeah.
well, and I try really hard not to create the show that everybody else is doing, not necessarily on purpose, but just because my brain works that way. I really have questions I want to ask. So anyway, so
Alrighty.
thank you so much, Bob. I will send a link via the email that we've been using when it's up, and it should be up within the next 3 weeks or so.
Perfect. Thank
Okay.
you for your time and energy. And
Oh, thank you, Bob. I appreciate it very much.
All right. Take care.
Hela Kasla. Check out Think Indian every Monday at 8 to 9 p.m. Think Indian is Van City's Aboriginal pop culture show featuring special guests, sharing community events, and playing a diverse range of musical genres from hip-hop, country, rock, blues, contemporary, and traditional. Think Indian every Monday at 8 to 9 p.m. on Vancouver's Co-op Radio and heard online at www.coopradio.org.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and that's our show. My thanks to Bob Joseph for coming and chatting with me about his book, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. If you're interested in getting that book, you can find it on Amazon. Music today was by Sherry Ulrich, and to you, our listeners, thank you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. You've just listened to Rethreading Madness, where we dare to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program, or want to share your story, or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. This is Bernadine Fox. We'll be back next week. Until then.
When I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do, when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through, just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright, don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, surely you don't have all of the facts. You could be just making it up. Why don't I ever think of that? It's some kind of magic in the words that you breathe, saying, baby, take it from me. It's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Everything's gonna be alright. With anyone else, it's such a cliche, just words people say to be nice. Or somehow